19 years ago, when my wife Lisa and I were expecting our fourth child, she woke me up about 2 in the morning out of a dead sleep and said, "I think my water just broke." Now, even though this was our fourth pregnancy, this was actually the first time that her water had broken on its own. So this was kind of new territory for us. And so I say to her, "Are you sure?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." And so she gets up to go to the bathroom and to clean herself up. And I get up and call the midwife and tell her, "Hey, we're going to have a baby." And then I go back to the bed and change the sheets and wait for my wife to come back to bed. And I wait and I wait and I think, what in the world is going on here? So I get up and I go to the bathroom to make sure my wife's okay. And I'm surprised to find her in there doing her makeup. And I said to her, "What in the world are you doing? You're about to go through labor." And she just kind of looks at me with this look like, what else would I be doing? And says, "Well, I want to look good for the pictures tomorrow." And I just thought at that point, I will never understand my wife's reasons for putting on her makeup. Well, I tell you that story because in this video, we're going to look at a biblical story of a woman who put her makeup on at a surprising time and how it ended up being the worst makeover ever. Stay tuned. Hello, I'm David Lang, and this is Bible to Life, where we bring the Bible to life so that it can better impact your life. Now, I'm happy to report that after 7+ hours of labor, my wife successfully delivered our fourth child, Alexa. And in spite of all the blood, sweat, and tears, my wife still managed to look good for the pictures and the videos. In today's video, we're going to read a biblical story in which the makeover was much less successful. Some time ago, we began a series of videos on the evil king Ahab and his wicked queen Jezebel, and the way that they sealed a man's doom in order to rob him of his land. They killed him and took over his land. And they were condemned for that act of oppression. The prophet Elijah came to Ahab and condemned him and told him that he was going to be killed and his line was going to be destroyed. And in that instance, Ahab repented, and so God relented and gave him a stay of execution. Ahab lived on for a number of years. And then in the second video in that series, we looked at how Ahab was eventually brought to justice. And he was brought to justice through a seemingly random act. But of course, it wasn't random. It was God's justice, and it took place according to God's design, even though Ahab had done everything he could to avoid that fate. Well, we left that video with Jezebel still alive and not yet brought to justice. And she was actually the one who was directly responsible for the death of this man. So she too has been condemned by the prophet Elijah, and her gruesome death has been prophesied, and yet she has lived on. Now, we pick up the story there. Jezebel has lived on for another dozen years or so after the death of Ahab. And she's had 2 of her sons sit on the throne of Israel. Ahaziah, who lived and ruled only a short time, and then her second son, Joram, who has ruled for another dozen years. And during that time, Jezebel has been the queen mother. And she was a dominant figure when she was the queen with Ahab. How much more is she running things when she's the queen mother and she has her sons listening to her? And so she has continued to lead the nation of Israel into apostasy, into the worship of the Canaanite gods Baal and the goddess Asherah, of whom she is a devotee. So now at last the time has come for judgment to come on the house of Ahab and on Jezebel herself. And so the prophet Elisha, who was the protege of the prophet Elijah, who had pronounced judgment on the house of Ahab, the prophet Elisha is now the main prophet. And he commissions one of his proteges, one of his prophetic disciples, to go to the town of Ramoth-Gilead. Now, the town of Ramoth-Gilead is the very city that Ahab was fighting to reconquer from the Arameans when he was killed. Apparently, in the 12 years that Joram has been on the throne, Ramoth-Gilead has come into the possession of the kingdom of Israel. And the armies of Israel are there expecting some kind of attack from the Arameans. And so the prophet Elisha sends this disciple to Ramoth-Gilead to anoint a man named Jehu. Now, Jehu is a military commander who is there with the army. And the prophet pulls him aside and anoints him as king. And then the army proclaims Jehu as the new king. And Jehu begins riding with his forces from Ramoth-Gilead to the town of Jezreel, which is King Joram's kind of winter capital. As he's riding there, furiously driving his chariot like a madman, it's described, King Joram notices this rider coming toward him, this force coming toward his city, and he sends out messengers. He says, well, this looks like it's Jehu, my military commander. I wonder if he's coming with news from the front. So he sends a messenger out to Jehu, and this messenger stops Jehu on the road and says, do you come in peace? And Jehu says, what do you have to do with peace? Get in behind me, fall in. And so the messenger falls in behind this military commander, and they proceed on toward Jezreel. And King Joram sends another messenger, and the same thing happens. What do you have to do with peace? Fall in behind me. So finally, King Joram goes out himself, rides out to meet Jehu. When Joram saw Jehu, he asked, do you come in peace, Jehu? He answered, what peace can there be as long as there is so much prostitution and sorcery from your mother Jezebel? So that's Jehu's response to Joram. And Joram immediately knows, oh boy, this is a coup, this is treachery, and he tries to escape. And Jehu draws his bow and shoots Joram between the shoulder blades as he's fleeing. But there's a royal figure that's still in Jezreel, and that's Jezebel herself. When Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard about it. So she painted her eyes, fixed her hair, and looked down from the window. As Jehu entered the city gate, she said, do you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master? He looked up toward the window and said, who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him, and he said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and Jehu rode over her. Then he went in, ate and drank, and said, take care of this cursed woman and bury her, since she's a king's daughter. But when they went out to bury her, they did not find anything but the skull, the feet, and the hands. So they went back and told him. And he said, this fulfills the Lord's word that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. In the plot of land at Jezreel, the dogs will eat Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's corpse will be like manure on the surface of the ground in the plot of land at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, this is Jezebel. By now, it should be obvious why I call this the worst makeover ever. Jezebel gets herself all dolled up, only to be thrown out of a window, splatter on the ground, and then be eaten by the feral dogs in Jezreel, so that all that's left of her is her skull, her feet, and her hands, basically the boniest and least fleshy parts of her. So she dies a gruesome death, as has been prophesied. The thing that's curious to me about this is, why did Jezebel get herself all fixed up in the first place? What was her reason for doing her makeup, fixing her hair, before she goes out to meet the usurper who has killed her son? Now, there are several possibilities. One is that she thought, well, maybe I can seduce this military commander and get him to keep me around and not kill me. And then, who knows, with Jezebel, she might have thought, well, if I can seduce him, I can eventually kill him and put another of my sons on the throne. Or she may have been thinking, even if I don't kill him, I can manage to persuade him to put one of my sons on the throne. If we're trying to determine whether Jezebel actually was attempting to seduce Jehu, one relevant question might be, well, how old was she at the time? Remember that she's the queen mother, and if she was an elderly woman, she might not have a reasonable expectation that she could seduce this military commander. But if she were still young enough to be able to seduce someone, then it might seem more plausible. We don't know how old Jezebel was when she married Ahab, nor do we know when she married Ahab. So we know that Ahab ruled for 20 years, and let's assume for the sake of argument that she married Ahab toward the beginning of his reign. And let's assume for the sake of argument that she was in her teenage years. Let's put her at 15. Maybe she got married at age 15 at the beginning of Ahab's reign. If that were the case, then she would be around 35 at the time that Ahab dies. And this is now 12 years after Ahab's death. So she's probably somewhere in her late 40s to early 50s. She might be a little younger, she might be a little older, but young enough to have a reasonable expectation that she could seduce someone. The other thing to be aware of is that she might, even if she were a little on the old side, she might have a reasonable expectation of being able to seduce this man into keeping her alive and marrying her by mere virtue of the fact that she is the queen mother. And by marrying her, Jehu could strengthen the legitimacy of his reign. And we see examples of this in Scripture where men would sleep with or marry the concubines or wives of the former king, even the king that they had deposed, to strengthen their hold over the throne. We see that with Absalom, David's son, when he rebels against David and David is forced to flee Jerusalem. Absalom is advised by his counselor to sleep with David's concubines as a way to show, I now have everything that once belonged to my father, and therefore I am the legitimate king. And we see it a little later when Solomon becomes king over his brother Adonijah. Well, his brother, who had made a play for the throne, and Solomon ends up being installed as king, later comes to Bathsheba and asks to be given one of David's former concubines as his wife. And Solomon says to his mother, why would you even entertain this thought? You might as well just give him the throne. So there was a sense in which marrying the spouse or concubine of a former ruler gave you some claim to the throne. And so Jezebel may have thought, Jehu, if he's smart and politically expedient, will try to keep me alive and make me his wife so that he can have a legitimate claim to the throne. So it's quite possible that she did intend to seduce Jehu somehow, and that's why she made herself up. Another thing to consider about her making herself up, it's definitely supposed to evoke the idea of seduction and prostitution. The painting of one's eyes is the act of a prostitute. And we are explicitly meant the text intends for us to call to mind prostitution with respect to Jezebel. We know that because earlier when Jehu confronts Joram, he says, "How can there be peace when there's all this prostitution and sorcery from your mother Jezebel?" So Jehu explicitly says there can be no peace because of your mother's prostitution. And that's a bit of foreshadowing because it means he's not going to be seduced by her. He's identified her prostitution as the problem. So when she paints her eyes, the reader is supposed to identify that as, see, this is just one more act of the prostitute. Now, does that mean that the text is saying that Jezebel is actually a prostitute or that she's actually engaged in sexual immorality? It doesn't necessarily mean that. We have a tendency to take evil women and kind of sexualize them and assume that their power over men is their power to control them sexually. But in Scripture, the only clear indication of someone that was Jezebel's sexual partner is Ahab, her husband. There's no indication that she actually slept with anybody other than Ahab. The reference to prostitution is probably a reference to the spiritual prostitution that Jezebel has led the nation of Israel into. She is leading them to prostitute themselves with Baal and with Asherah, with these foreign gods, rather than remaining faithful to the God of Israel. And so that's what's clearly in view in terms of prostitution. Now, was she sexually profligate? Perhaps she was, but that's not necessarily the case. But the text wants us to associate her with a prostitute, and so the text makes it clear that she paints her eyes as a prelude to confronting Jehu. Although the text clearly wants us to scorn Jezebel as a spiritual prostitute, and although it's quite plausible that she was trying to seduce Jehu so that she could survive, I'm not entirely convinced that she is trying to seduce Jehu. I'm not entirely convinced that that's why she did herself up. And here's why. When she confronts Jehu, she says to him, "Do you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master?" She doesn't call him Jehu. She calls him by a different name. She calls him Zimri. Now, who is Zimri? And Zimri was a usurper whose reign was not particularly long-lived. In 1 Kings 16:10, we read, "In the 27th year of Judah's king Asa, Zimri went in and struck Elah down, killing him." Elah was the king of Israel. "Then Zimri became king in his place. When he became king, as soon as he was seated on his throne, Zimri struck down the entire house of Baasha," that was Elah's father. "He did not leave a single male, including his kinsmen and his friends." In the 27th year of Judah's king Asa, Zimri became king for 7 days in Tirzah. So Zimri's reign lasts a grand total of 7 days. Now the troops were encamped against Gibbethon of the Philistines. When these troops heard that Zimri had not only conspired, but had also struck down the king, then all Israel made Omri, the army commander, king over Israel that very day in the camp. Omri, along with all Israel, marched up from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city was captured, he entered the citadel of the royal palace and burned it down over himself. He died because of the sin he committed by doing what was evil in the Lord's sight, and by walking in the ways of Jeroboam and the sin he caused Israel to commit. So Zimri is a usurper who seizes the throne of Israel, and almost as soon as everybody hears about him becoming king, they say, "Oh no, you didn't," and they elect another king, the army commander Omri. And Omri, who has the army on his side, marches to Tirzah, which is Zimri's capital, which is Israel's capital, and captures the city. And when Zimri realizes it's all over, he goes into the palace and he burns it down and commits suicide. So his reign lasts for 7 inglorious days, and he's overthrown by Omri. Now, Omri is the father of Ahab, who is Jezebel's former husband. So she knows this history well. And when she says to Jehu, "Have you come in peace, Zimri, killer of your master?" she's insulting him. She's making fun of him. She's saying to him, "You're no better than this guy who is just a footnote in the history of Israel. You're no better than this guy who ended up burning down the palace over his head." So that to me is a pretty good indication that maybe she wasn't trying to seduce Jehu, because if she was intending to seduce him, why would she insult him like this? If her intention was to insult Jehu, why does she do herself up? It may be that she intends to confront Jehu like a queen, right? She's defiant and she does herself up in all her royal regalia so that she can intimidate this army commander who has killed her son and remind him not so subtly, "Look, your reign is going to be short-lived because you're no different than Zimri, who was the last guy that killed the king of Israel." Okay, so far we've entertained 2 possible explanations for why Jezebel does herself up before meeting her destiny. One is that she's trying to survive by seducing this usurper. The other possibility is that she is trying to be defiant to the last and intimidate this usurper into backing down by donning all the trappings of royalty and threatening him. There's one other possibility, and this one is by far the most intriguing. One of the things that is interesting about this story is that Jezebel does herself up and then looks out a window. And archaeologists have found a number of images throughout the ancient Near East, in Israel, in Assyria, all over the ancient Near East. There are these ivory plaques that depict a woman dressed up in, makeup and hair and looking almost like an Egyptian princess and staring out a window. Archaeologists debate, well, what is the meaning of this? Does this represent a prostitute who is sort of advertising her wares by showing herself out the window? Is this a representation of the goddess Asherah, whom Jezebel worships, and she's, looking out the window expectantly for Baal or something like that? There are all kinds of proposals for what the significance of this imagery is. But the imagery is very common in the ancient Near East. And this description of Jezebel certainly evokes that imagery. Perhaps Jezebel is self-consciously doing herself up and looking out the window to evoke this imagery. And if it is an image of Asherah, the goddess who is the consort of Baal, the goddess whom Jezebel is a devotee of and possibly even a priestess of, then she may be doing herself up to look like Asherah and to be reminiscent of Asherah so that she can threaten Jehu by saying, "Look, you can't touch me because if you touch me, you'll anger the goddess. I'm her particular devotee, and In case you forgot that, here I am looking just like her, looking out the window. So that's a really interesting possibility, that she's deliberately playing on this religious imagery to further intimidate Jehu into not messing with her. So whatever Jezebel was intending to do, whether she was intending to seduce Jehu or to intimidate Jehu or to portray herself as semi-divine and so therefore untouchable, her plan, her design, her makeover doesn't accomplish whatever she's trying to do, because Jehu calls up and says, "Who's on my side?" And several of her eunuchs or officials, attendants, look out the window, and when Jehu says, "Throw that woman down," they grab her and toss her out the window. And one can imagine the panic and the hysteria of that moment. It's not an easy thing to shove somebody out a window if they're fighting for their life and doing everything they can to avoid letting go. And so all of her regalia and her finery and her dignity and her seductive power, whatever it was that she was trying to accomplish through this makeover, it all falls apart when she gets tossed out the window. And then, of course, the result is all very gory and horrific. She falls to her death. Her blood splatters on the horses as they're standing there. And Jehu, in his callousness, just rides right over her dead body and goes in and has dinner and assumes the throne and takes over the palace. And then, as he's eaten his fill and had a chance to reflect, he says, all right, well, you know what? She is the daughter of a king. She was a Phoenician princess who had married Ahab. And so he says, go ahead and bury her because she is a king's daughter. Let's at least pay her the proper respect. And then we find the gory details that all that has survived from the feral dogs are her skull and her hands and her feet. What are we to draw from this story? Besides all of the interesting details and the gory details, what can we learn from the story of Jezebel? Ultimately, what we can learn is that no matter how much we scheme and try to preserve ourselves, no matter what we do to ensure our own safety and our own survival, if we're under the judgment of God, we are going to pay the penalty for our sins. Ahab was not able to escape his fate, and Jezebel was not able to escape her fate. She lived a little while longer, but ultimately her death was even more horrific. We may survive for a little bit, but eventually we will suffer the judgment of God. And the only hope that's ever been seen in these stories of Ahab and Jezebel is when Ahab repented of his sins and God relented and said, all right, I'll give you more time. When sinners turn to God and seek his mercy, that's where mercy is found, and that's the only place that mercy can be found. All our efforts as sinners to find ways to get around punishment, to escape punishment, and to escape judgment, and to escape the consequences of our actions, all of those will ultimately come to naught. We can escape for a little while, but eventually justice will be done. And so it's important for us to realize as sinners that our only hope for mercy is in the means of grace that God provides. And of course, as a Christian, I believe it's in Christ that we find that mercy, that he is the way and the truth and the life, the only escape from sin. Thanks for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please click the like button. And if you'd like to be notified of future videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Also, in the comments, let me know which of the possibilities for Jezebel's makeover you found most convincing. Do you think she was trying to seduce Jehu? Was she simply trying to go out like a queen? Was she trying to intimidate him? Or was she appealing to the religious imagery of Asherah to make herself seem untouchable? Let me know what you think was most convincing. Thanks. Have a great day.